From our newsroom in London, this is The Standard. This edition is a preview of the latest episode of Brave New World, a podcast where Evgeny Lebedev speaks to leading experts about the latest trends in modern medicine and how to maximise health and longevity. To hear the whole interview and listen to previous episodes, search Brave New World Evening Standard on your podcast provider.
This summer, I travelled to Costa Rica for, amongst other things, a stem cell treatment, but that's for another episode. I also happened to have attended a psychedelic retreat, a rather brilliant place called Suara in the Nicoya Peninsula. There, accompanied by two Shipibo traditional healers from the indigenous peoples of Peru and 18 other patients, we took our psychedelic of choice, Ayahuasca. David Nutt is a clinical psychologist and the godfather of the field of psychedelic therapy. I've spoken to him before on my podcast, Brave New World, and I'm delighted to welcome him back. Before we go into my experience, I'd be really interested just to hear from you about the studies that you've done with DMT.
We started off studying psilocybin because we know it's very safe. It's been widely used. Millions of young people have been eating magic mushrooms in Britain for decades, so it was safe. And then we moved on to LSD because, of course, that's the one that is most famous, the one that put psychedelia on the map through the writings of Hoffman and Aldous Huxley, etc. And then we thought, well, we better make sure this is a general phenomenon. So then we started to work with DMT. Now, we couldn't work with ayahuasca because ayahuasca is a herbal mixture. It was probably going to be impossible to get permission because the regulators, the MHRA, would say, no, you can't prove what's in it. So we used pure DMT. And because if you take pure DMT, it's broken down in the liver, we had to give it intravenously. So that's what we did. And then we found it produced this profound alteration in consciousness in the same way as psilocybin and LSD, but more quickly. And we can see that if we inject DMT into someone, into their vein, within seconds, they're having a trip. And you can see that their EEG is completely changed. It's fragmented. And that's what you get after an hour with psilocybin orally. So they all produce this same profound disruption of rhythmicity in the brain, synchrony in the brain. It's a state we call entropy. It's a state of disorganization, which explains the hallucinations because your brain can't reconstruct the external world as it used to. It explains the insights. It explains a sense of floating away into different parts of space or to different dimensions because your brain isn't able to work out exactly where you are in space anymore. So that perturbation of underlying rhythmic activity is very profound. So, I mean, ayahuasca, one has to admit, as a psychopharmacologist of the current century, you have to admire and respect the amazing insights that those indigenous peoples of the Amazon basin, they made one of the most fascinating psychopharmacological cocktails there's ever been made. Of course, the shamans say this was something given to them, from heaven. This was an insight that was achieved through getting in touch with their gods, and how it arrived, one doesn't know. But what it is, it's a cocktail of two separate plants which are brewed together. One of the plants contains DMT, which, as I've already said, if you take orally, doesn't work because the liver breaks it down. But the other plant contains what we call a beta carboline called harmine. Harmine blocks the breakdown of DMT. So ayahuasca is a drinkable form of DMT. It's the same as drinking magic mushroom tea. It allows the DMT to get into the body, get to work. And that's why it gives you much longer trips and why it can be used in, it's very easy to calibrate. You can take a large cup or a small cup. I don't know what you took. Maybe you took several cups.
Well, this was over a number of days. I went to an ayahuasca retreat in Costa Rica called Suara, which was brilliant. It was probably one of the strangest things I've ever done in my life, if not the strangest. Parallel to this, I just felt that I've, in the last 2-3 years, I've gone into this. I've been calling it a sort of hamster wheel or a Ferris wheel where I couldn't quite get off. It was a loop of thoughts and activities that were obviously some kind of coping mechanism, and I had to do something to break it down. And I've tried all sorts of things that people would do to just stop and rest, and they just weren't working.
The hamster wheel is an extremely good analogy because actually kind of how the brain works. Once it starts doing things, it can't stop.
My fight or flight mode has been extremely alert. I felt like I've been tense, and I suppose if you are persistently feel like you're under attack, which I have been baselessly by various media outlets. I say baselessly because it's all been based on rumor and innuendo, hearsay, and absolutely no fact or proof. And so it's put me in this sort of fight or flight tense mode that I just could not get out of, and I just felt like I had to find some kind of sledgehammer to break it, and this certainly was that. The first part, of course, for me was a huge therapeutic process in itself, was being in a group, because I'm such a solitary, isolationist individual, and always have been all my life. And the group was mostly American. And just hearing, of course, I can't break the confidentiality of the circle, and there was some very grueling stories told there, but even it was just humbling being there and hearing the stories of people's lives and the torment and the pain people have gone through. Even that in itself is somehow healing.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
And so there were 4 ceremonies, and even after the first ceremony, which I took a small dose, I already felt like that loop, like that hamster wheel stopped. And that was the first time I felt that in probably years. So it definitely works. There were lots and lots of things, which we don't have time to go into all of them, but some of the more curious things that came to mind were my surgery came to me. I was 3 months old, and I had I think it's called in the intestinal intersection, when the intestines get entangled, and I was operated on, and of course I have no recollection of this whatsoever, apart from a huge scar on my belly. But I had this vision of being in a 1980 surgical theater in Moscow, which would be very kind of austere, bright lights, doctor wearing a doctor's hat and a mask and an old school mirror on the forehead, and then it all fades out. And it was I guess it brought back feelings of fear and.
I'm not surprised. I mean, it's well, you could have died. I mean, that kind of interception is very serious. If you didn't get it operated on, you could have died, and it was obviously a massive physiological as well as emotional stress, which I guess you've not thought about much since. Had you ever thought about it since? Or
I've never. I felt that somehow, physiologically, perhaps the scar blocks things off, because it is a very big scar that I have. Definitely a very Soviet scar. But no, I've not thought about that at all.
You're touching on something that, to me, has become really quite central to my thinking about the nature of trauma and the nature and how psychedelics can help trauma, because it seems to me that trauma in childhood does lay down patterns of thinking that are very difficult to erase and which distort your relationships for the rest of your lives. And psychedelics may be the only way we can actually really get to terms with them, because they're so deeply ingrained.
Yes, it seems that way. I mean, I don't think any number of psychotherapy or any other therapy would ever tap that deeply into my 3-month-old self. And then the other thing that came up again, what the shamans, the healers would call ancestral trauma, epigenetic trauma, is I had this, my family all lived in Moscow in the 1930s, and that was a time of great terror where people were terrified. And I had this vision of a Moscow a communal flat. So just to explain to listeners, that time in the 1920s and 30s, and in the Soviet Union, many people lived in communal flats, which were flats confiscated from wealthy merchants and just gentry, aristocracy, workers and peasants who came into cities from living in the provinces and villages were located in rooms, or sometimes a couple of families in one room, or there'd be families living in the corridors, kitchens. And so a lot of people lived in communal flats, at least until the 40s and 50s. And so I had this vision of a communal flat and the washing line and the kitchen, the stove, and just a feeling of fear, and which I guess is something that has stayed in my epigenome. And particularly, I know that my great-grandfather, who worked in the Ministry of Food Supply during the war, he was deputy minister. There was a lot of fear of, and I think there was a lot of fear in everyone's families, really.
Well, indeed, that was Stalin's style, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
So
fear was what made things work. Yeah.
Yes. And people disappeared at night, and nobody asked questions. Anyway, I'd be interested to hear how you'd interpret that.
Well, I think you're right. I think there's no question that fear and anxiety in mothers changes the risk sensitivity of children, makes them more anxious, more vulnerable. Certainly, so at least through one generation. And as you mentioned, we've got evidence now that you can have epigenetic changes through fathers as well over multiple generations. So I think it's plausible in a biological sense, but of course in a psychological sense, it's also part of your family narrative, isn't it? I mean, I guess your grandfather was essentially his survival depended on the party, and if he transgressed and found evidence in his scientific work that didn't fit with the communist narrative, he was likely to have lost his job and maybe his life. So it was, I think, it's completely credible that you've got these two separate.
From what I understand, he died when I was 3 years old. The attitude was that you make one mistake and you disappear. And also, particularly because he was in charge of food, it was not acceptable to make a mistake, particularly during the war, the Great Patriotic War. So that must have been a lot of fear that somebody lived with.
Yes. I wouldn't have wanted to have had that job, I can tell you.
And then I guess the only other one I'd mentioned, which was really interesting, is that, I'm somebody who likes to be in control, and I know that it affects negatively a lot of things in my life. And by God, one of the ceremonies, I lost control. I was in this sort of black void, falling, and
but you survived, and this is the point. This is exactly the point. You survived. You didn't fight it. I mean, one of the things we've learned from our therapeutic sessions with various different people with different diagnoses, if you fight it, if you resist it, you don't get the benefit. And in fact,
and it's very hard for me not to fight it, because I am someone who likes to be in control. Very, very hard. So it was a really, really important and a very good lesson for me.
And the lesson is that you can lose control and come back not only alive, but maybe better, because you can lose control. You can survive without controlling everything.
Last thing I wanted to ask you is, and I know this is a bone to pick that a lot of people who work with shamans and healers have with the likes of yourself and Robin and people who just do science, is the neglect of the sort of the historical healer shamanic aspect, or particularly ayahuasca and DMT. How do you see that? What's your view of how do you, and also can it somehow be integrated, would you say?
Yeah, so how do modern neuroscientists think about the historic and indigenous use of these drugs? Well, the first thing I say is I'm extremely grateful for all the work that's been done over the last 7,000 years. And I always start all my talks on psychedelics by making that point, and making the point that they've been part of human experience for a while. We know that the very first representations of psychedelics are the mushroom carvings in the caves in Algeria, which go back 5,000 years BCE. We also know, and I think we've got to give a lot of credit to the ancient Greeks. They worked out that a cocktail of alcohol, wine, and the weak psychedelic lysergamide in ergot was a very powerful way of being creative, and the Eleusinian mysteries were fueled for hundreds of years. The Greeks celebrated art, dance, theatre, music, using psychedelics as part of their to promote the right mental state. And I think it's extremely, you can make the case, and I do all the time, that the Greek culture, which of course ended up, driving most of the modern Western culture in terms of things like mathematics, like logic, like philosophy, as well as art. The flowering of intellectual growth in ancient Greece over 1,500 years, at least was associated with the use of psychedelics, and maybe psychedelics, basically underpin that. In which case, they underpin Western society. We also know in Hindu religion, it's very likely that soma, the drink that was thought to have generated these rather interesting images of multi-armed gods, etc., was probably a cocktail of cannabis and magic mushrooms with semiphedra. So psychedelics have been around for a very long time. They probably had a phenomenal impact on human development, human culture, human thinking. We're one of the very few cultures, one of the very few periods in history where we've tried to eliminate that. And we've specifically tried to eliminate them because they make people challenge the rather strange and rather militaristic and perhaps over competitive and over commercial way in which we've been running our lives the last 200-300 years.
That was a preview of Brave New World. You can hear the whole show and listen to previous episodes by searching Brave New World Evening Standard in your podcast provider.